Think about it. That's his strategy. He's born in Tarsus, capital of Cilicia. Every time we find him, he's in a capital. He's in Antioch, capital of Syria. He's in Thessalonica, capital of Macedonia. Corinth, capital of Achaia. Ephesus, capital of Asia. And he dies in Rome, capital of the whole empire. So he takes Jesus out into the great Roman Empire, into the capital cities, and figures from there it'll go everywhere else. Secondly, the message of Jesus and the message of Paul. Different language, of course. I don't mean Aramaic and Greek, I mean different theological expressions. Are exactly the same. They are both claiming, they are both proclaiming that the kingdom of God, by whatever name, the eschaton, is already here. It is not apocalyptically imminent. It is already here. And that means it is a matter not of pure divine intervention, but of divine and human collaboration. 27 books in the New Testament, 13 of them are attributed to Paul. 13 are attributed to Paul. And another one, the Acts of the Apostles, is half about him. So he gets half the New Testament. That simply means if you don't like him, you don't like half the New Testament. That's not an argument, just a statement. Of those 13 letters, there is a massive consensus of scholarship. And Marcus and I know that a massive consensus of scholarship is called a miracle. Yeah, really is. There's a massive consensus of scholarship that of those 13, 7 of them are definitely, certainly from Paul, from the historical Paul. The 7 being Romans and Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians and Philemon, and 1st Thessalonians. Those are definitely from Paul. And words like definitely, certainly are historical judgments, of course, not dogmatic preambles. Of the other 6, 3 of them are probably not from Paul. I think there's a consensus on the probably not. That's Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. And the final 3, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are certainly not from Paul. That's the general consensus. Now let me stress a couple of things. None of that decision was made because of political correctness of anything in there that people didn't like. They were really made well, in the last 100 years by scholars who looked at the vocabulary, looked at the theology, said, this is really different. This can't be from the same person. That's what happened. But here's the much more important part. Originally, when that consensus was established, people said, well, there's no big deal here. There's sort of like a Pauline school. It was quite acceptable in contemporary Jewish and Christian writing to write in the name of a revered predecessor. In the 1st century BCE, a Jewish text was created called the Last Will and Testament of Moses. About, 1,000 years later, but no problem. So that's not the problem at all. The problem is this, that as you proceed from what we call the first Paul, the authentic original Paul, to the next Paul and the later Paul, you are not just going post-Pauline, you're going anti-Pauline. That's the point. What you're doing is sanitizing, deradicalizing, gutting like a fish the authentic Paul. And therefore Marcus and I, to focus on that, talk about the radical Paul, the first Paul of those 7 letters, the conservative Paul, the Paul of Colossians and Ephesians, and finally the reactionary Paul of Timothy and Titus. And please believe me, and Marcus and I know this very, very well, once you have read about Paul in Luke's Acts of the Apostles, it is almost impossible ever to see him again except through Lucan spectacles. Luke's too good a writer. He sort of trapped you in his own vision. And it's not that Luke is inept or something like that. It's that Luke is 2 generations at least after Paul. There is no evidence he ever read a single one of Paul's epistles. Does he know about Paul? Yes. He has lots of information about Paul and a very different interpretation of Paul. Because he's taking Paul, as he does with Jesus, of course, in his gospel, into his generation. Gospel, as Marcus said, is good news. Good news is never old news. So a gospel, by definition, brings the good news into contemporary relevance. Luke is doing it in his, of course. But that means we have to be very careful when we read Luke and Paul. Careful to see where they agree, careful to see where they disagree, and most difficult of all, how do we analyze when Luke gives us data that Paul doesn't? And the only way to decide is if the data that Luke gives you sort of disagrees with Luke's own general themes and emphasis. If it agrees with Paul, there's no problem. 2 examples in a hurry. And I'm not going into minor details. I'm only interested in major theological differences. Paul lives and dies as an apostle. Almost every epistle begins with Paul, comma, an apostle, comma. He didn't put in commas. An apostle. That means somebody who's apostellined. In Greek, who's sent. Apostelline. Sent by whom? That's the whole thing. Paul says, sent by God through Christ. And therefore on a par, on an equal with Peter, James, with everyone else who was sent by the earthly Christ. Paul's claim to authority, Paul's claim to theology is, I was sent by the heavenly Christ. You guys were sent by the earthly Christ. We were all sent by Christ. I might be, he'll say politely, the least of the apostles. But if you're the least, you're an apostle. Now, that is crucial. It has huge theological implications. And believe me, Luke sees it very clearly. Wait a minute. If God or Christ could appear to Paul a couple of years after the ascension, oops, who's in control of this church? If Jesus keeps slipping back from heaven to appoint apostles, he might even appoint a woman someday. Seriously, Luke goes to a lot of trouble to say there are 12 apostles. Judas went somewhere else, shall we say. Must be replaced by one of the males, he says, Luke, Acts of the Apostles, one of the Andres, one of the males who was with us from the beginning. Paul is not an apostle. He may be sent by Jerusalem or by Antioch, but not by God and Christ. And that has huge implications. Let me turn to the God worshippers, because of time. This is a fascinating case because it's in Luke, and it's not in Paul. And many scholars before it said, oh, Luke just makes this up. There's no such thing as these God worshippers. This is just Lucan. Personally, I never believed it because I couldn't figure out why he would want to create them. And I think within the last few years, the consensus of archaeological evidence has confirmed them. You understand the importance of archaeological evidence. It's awful hard to get rid of stone. Texts, you can say, well, they can get lost, or you can say, well, they're just making it up. And then you turn over a stone that's been, a lintel or something in a peasant house, and you find something written on it. Nobody faked that. So, what's the implications? We have to figure 3 groups. There were, of course, Jews and, of course, Gentiles, non-Jews and Jews, to put it from their point of view. We're now seeing an in-between group called, by whatever name, Luke uses God worshippers and God-fearers. In many of the texts I showed you, the term is God worshippers. These are Gentiles. If they're males, they are not circumcised. That's the chop-chop that makes it very clear, the difference. By the way, when you're thinking of that, realize how much more difficult it is to tell a God-fearer woman, and how much easier it might be to be a God-fearer woman. How could you really tell? I mean, obviously. So, We have to deal with this in-between group of God worshippers who are Gentiles, who are male if they're not circumcised, but who accept the Jewish God, and we have to face the fact that that's not as weird as we've made it sound. Lots of pious, thinking people looked at the gods, Zeus I was going to call them, Zeus and Jupiter, and said, oh my God, we're supposed to imitate them? There must be a God behind the gods, as it were. So, Jewish monotheism, Jewish morality, Jewish family values, Jewish community cohesion. Lots of things that people who are Gentile, without wanting to leave the whole Gentile world, admired in Judaism, and above all, attended the synagogue.